Hey everybody, it's Holly from Creatures. Oh my god, my Peter is being a total asshat this morning. Okay, so we're here with a quick part 2 of the review for the Goliath Tarot. Specifically, its use as a deck for shadow work. So the artist Goliath decided that he was going to create a deck for shadow work because there was, in his words, he found the spiritual tool market. I'm reading from his guidebook on this page, you guys. He found the spiritual tool market oversaturated with light-bearing esoterica that is based only on positive affirmations that completely ignore the reality and integration of oneness. He decided to create something that could be used to funnel or hone in and focus on a more specific and deeper purpose. Suppressing and denying things such as shadow can be incredibly dangerous and can actually lead to less cohesive being and some incredible behavior. Sometimes in life, we just have to deal with things head on. If we have unresolved trauma or wounds that need to be dealt with, particularly from our past or childhood, we need to acknowledge them and know that we have not fully healed by going back to that time and space. Looking at it and look at it as an adult. This can give us higher perspective and a better chance to access it, process it, and then learn from it so that way we can integrate it into our being. Okay, so I'm going to, and then he goes into his shadow story and how he did some shadow work. Very informative. It's nice when somebody does have kind of a, this is how I did some shadow work, and you know, I do like this is how I created a deck section in a guidebook and my experience with working with my own deck, so that way you kind of know maybe what to expect. The integration of the shadow story, though, is more of a, when you read it, it's more of a, so it's kind of like an exercise that I remember from Eclectic Tarot Forum called Intuitive Tarot Reading, where it's more of a story based on what you observe. It's almost like reading about a dreamscape type thing. Not so much this is how I did some shadow work and this is how it helped me, which I think would have been nice to have put in the guidebook. And then I want to just, so first let's touch on what shadow work is. Shadow work is when you use tarot to bring up or to help you process some thoughts about stuff in your life or stuff about yourself that is not so great. And I love shadow work. I think it's an essential part of working with tarot. I don't think that you can do tarot without doing shadow work. I mean, like you can, but I mean, every time you do, you kind of are. There's that voice in the back of your head that's like, oh, by the way. And it depends on what you have going on and how heavy you decide to go with it. Personally, I think it's a tad irresponsible to suggest that you use tarot to dredge up unresolved trauma. At least not without, I know he says in a safe space. It's prickly as far as that's concerned. I think that if you're going to, your mind has a way of telling you when it's time for you to deal with traumas in your past. Using tarot as a tool to help you through that trauma, fine. Using tarot as a tool to dredge up unresolved traumas that you're not ready to deal with, not okay. And then if your trauma is really that intense, you should probably also do it under the guise of professional. You should do it under the guidance of a licensed professional. He makes no mention of that anywhere in this book. Shadow work can be really, really intense, and it's a good idea to have that kind of, not supervision, but that kind of guidance, because honestly, I would have put just for legal purposes, I would have put that in this guidebook. You don't know what people are dealing with as far as shadow work is concerned. You have no idea what it might dredge up. So, yeah. And then if you're going to go ahead and approach, if you think you're ready to approach shadow work, you don't have to use a deck that's made specifically for it. So this is kind of turning into what shadow work is, I guess. We'll touch on it in specifics to this deck in a bit. You don't have to use a deck that's specifically for shadow work. You can use any tarot deck. And it depends on the kind of issues that you're dealing with. You might want to choose one of those quote unquote light bearing decks. Actually, Cosmic Creeper has a wonderful, I think it was on Instagram, but it might also be on YouTube. If she doesn't have it on YouTube, she should put a video on YouTube about using those light bearing esoterica decks to gently deal with and resolve certain aspects of shadow work, because the subject matter is so heavy, and for some people it can be so traumatic. You don't need a deck to be all like, hey, you deal with your bullshit. That isn't what some people necessarily need. And I would argue that you don't always even need tarot to do shadow work. One of my favorite decks for shadow work would be these two Bad Larrys, the soul cards, because they're not tarot. They don't have any words. It's all, take a look at these cards and see if there's anything in there that kind of strikes a chord with you. Process it in your own time, kind of a thing. It doesn't have a pre-prescribed meaning, which I find to be incredibly helpful for shadow work. Other people might use, and I'm sourcing a thread on For Love of Tarot. It's a Facebook group, or For Love of Cards, for people who like to collect cards and discuss them and discuss tarot reading. Some people like to use, if they're doing, for example, work with childhood issues, they'll use a super cute childhood deck like the Crystal Unicorn. The Happy Tarot is another really good one. I do like a traditional Rider-Waite for working with childhood issues because it's very coloring book style. The Kwai Tarot is another really good one. Do I have that handy? I think I do. Yes. This is a cute one for childhood issues if you're going to do that one. And then otherwise, just any tarot deck, whatever is calling to you that day, is fine to use for shadow work. As far as tips for using it for working with shadow work, the traditional reversed meanings, you can apply to shadow, like a deck, like the for example, like the Three of Cups reversed could imply there's some issues there with the overconsumption of alcoholic beverages, partying too hard with your friends in lieu of, like paying more attention to your social obligations than to your professional and home ones. It could imply that there was problems in the past, maybe with, again, that one is associated, at least for me, very heavily with alcohol consumption. Not necessarily by yourself, but it could be by others in your life. And then, just the other thing too is not always the reversed meaning is the shadow meaning. It could be the right side up meaning. It could be, shadow work could be as easy as dealing with, missing your childhood best friend and wondering why they fell off the face of why you guys grew apart and why why they fell off the face of the planet. And that kind of left like a little hole in your life, something like that. It could be as silly as that. Or I'm not going to say silly because it's not silly, but it could be as minor as that. It's certainly not like, it's not abuse. It's not trauma. It's not heavy accident, that kind of harm. It's kind of like, oh, well, that kind of sucked. And I remember that, and the feels. So shadow work could be as easy as dealing with minor feels. Shadow work is also, shadow work is not when your deck drags you. It's a little more serious than that. I like to joke that shadow work is when your deck drags you, and if we're being serious, that's not what it is. It's not when your tarot deck calls you out on some stuff, at least in the immediate present future. Like, Fighting with my husband and your deck's kind of like, it's your fault. Like maybe you should have folded that laundry. Like that's not shadow work. That is our subconscious voice being like, no, that's our subconscious voice telling us like, you're wrong. And shadow work's a little more serious than stuff like that. Although if you're going to explore the shadow of, actually, you know what a great deck for shadow work is, and I just brought it down from upstairs. This is a fantastic deck for shadow work. It uses Gotaic demonology to explore some of the less desirable aspects of light and shadow. Like it's kind of like too much of a good thing is a bad thing in some of the aspects of its cards. Like how ambition and drive can sometimes lead to undesirable behavior. It's got demons in here that deal with maybe some not nice aspects of people to begin with, like greed and the 7 deadly sins, greed and gluttony and avarice and a few other different things. So this deck is actually fantastic for shadow work if you're looking to do kind of surfacey type shadow work. Otherwise, you can use any deck. You do not need to use a deck that is specifically designed for it. However, if you're going to design a deck specifically for shadow work, which I applaud somebody doing, because I think that is definitely a niche missing from the market. I would at least like to see, maybe there is a good book. Actually, if anybody has any recommendations, I would love to see in the doobly, in the comments later, if you could recommend good books for shadow work. That would be fantastic. I'd love to see something like that. As far as shadow work is concerned, in Goliath, these 2 pages are really the last time we see specifically about shadow work, at least in a really big amount. As far as I can tell, I'm going to caveat this with as far as I can tell, because I am still in the process of really reading this book. Every once in a while, he does mention some of the drawbacks of the tarot cards that he drew, and some of the symbolism, but he doesn't always apply it to shadow work specifically. If you're going to do a shadow work specific deck, it would have been nice to see like traditional meaning of the card blurb, and then here's how you would apply it to shadow work specifically. Just a little more of a guided approach, I think, would have been fantastic. He does put in reverse meanings, which could be applied to shadow work that way. I would have loved to have seen a section in this book about how to conduct shadow work. There is a what is shadow work, and he tells you to just be gentle with yourself, and because you're dredging stuff up from a well of God knows what. It's kind of like sending a bucket down a well and not knowing what you're going to bring up. I would argue that if you're going to do shadow work, you should only do shadow work for like unsupervised shadow work. You should only do that. You should only do that kind of shadow work with issues that you're already, it's trauma you've already faced and you are ready to deal with it. You're ready to process it. It's, you shouldn't be doing shadow work for the purpose of dredging up like suppressed or repressed memories or repressed trauma. Your brain and your body does that for a reason. It represses that stuff for a reason until you are ready to process it. At least that is, as far as I'm concerned, that is, it's a survival mechanism. And while trauma does need to be dealt with eventually, it just, again, I really would have liked to have seen some sort of caveat there about licensed professionals, about, seeking psychiatric care or help if that was something to do. That would have been, again, it just would have been smart from a legal standpoint. So anywho, so yeah, you do get, like I said, you do get reversed card meanings. And occasionally he does put in a journal prompt, but yeah, a guided approach would have been much better. As far as the visual of this deck being, I find this deck to be actually for as so the artwork is inconsistent, and I'm finding that to be a little bit of a block as well. But it is balanced as far as its representation of light and shadow. I find this deck to be more of a balanced deck than anything. Could you use it for shadow? Absolutely. You could use it for shadow work if you wanted. Do you have to? No, absolutely not. You know, the meanings that he gives are definitely there. So far, they've been balanced as far as their positive and their not so positive aspects of the descriptions. Is there anything especially shadowy about them? I don't think so. I think that this is no more dark or light than you would find in any good tarot book. That's going to really delve into some of the meanings. So yeah, if you're going to do shadow work, what I would recommend is, he says get comfy. I say get a journal. You know, make sure that it's an issue that you're ready to deal with, and make sure that, you know, again, you have, I'm not going to say a buddy system, but a buddy system is probably a good idea. If you are, I'm kind of a hardy broad, and I've done a lot of work, shadow work, and just even regular work on myself as far as dealing with some issues and whatnot in my life. And at one point, I did have a licensed professional, and I did a lot of my shadow work there. It wasn't necessarily through tarot, but it was journaling. And every once in a while, I do find myself having to reprocess some of those issues. And that's when I use tarot. I find it great because I journaled exhaustively, which is probably why I don't journal so much these days, because it's just kind of like, it feels more like homework at this point for me. But get a journal, record your thoughts, record your feelings. You know, if you are dealing with an issue that's kind of heavy, make sure that you have somebody supportive there to listen to you, or at least to be there for you should you need it. If that's an issue, reach out to fellow members of your tarot community. We're here for you to support you, and we know how hard it is to do shadow work. Also, I don't really appreciate how he dismisses the oversaturation of positivity and light working in the marketplace. There's a reason it's all there right now. There's a reason that people are focusing more on that right now. And it's, whether it's part of a universal consciousness shift to be focusing more on positive things than negative things, whether it's a search for positive things in an extremely negative world. You know, it just, I don't think it's nice to be like, meh, there's too much of that. I don't think there's ever enough positivity in this world. There can never be enough. And it seems, I don't know, I'm not going to say it doesn't seem necessarily dismissive of people who might be bringing out positive decks. It seems, I don't know. I didn't appreciate that kind of a statement, about how there's too much. I don't think there's ever too much. I think maybe if he had put it in this is where an editor would have been beautiful. It could have been phrased a little differently to say that, you know, maybe there seemed to be a lack in the market for shadow. You know, for a deck that's for shadow, for a deck that explores psychological issues. And I would argue that is not the case either. Actually, we're seeing a reemerge, like most tarot decks these days are like, there's some light and love, and those seem to get a lot of marketing, but a lot of the decks being released these days there's a ton of black and white being released right now. There's at least 2 or 3 that I know of that either just came out of Kickstarter or are just finally being shipped out to their people. And then the is it the Vagabond? No, not the Vagabond. Maybe the Voyager Tarot. And then the Waking Light and the Shadow of Dark and Light. The Darkness of Light Tarot is one that you could argue is good for shadow work. The Dream Keeper's Tarot is fantastic for shadow work. The El Goliath is another black and white one. Yeah, so the one that we're talking about, black and white deck. The Bianco Nero just came out as a black and white deck. That one is fantastic. I would argue that Influence of the Angels is another one that is, well, it's not a black and white deck. The colors are more subdued and it focuses on art history and a very balanced aspect of the tarot. Is there a market for like the cutesy stuff? Yes, of course. Who doesn't love a unicorn deck that's going to be like, this is for gentle, fun readings? Nope. And if you wanted to maybe do a serious reading with it, fine. But I feel like the market is actually pretty balanced right now. You know, the Los Scarabeo is releasing a couple of really great balanced decks along with Llewellyn. I'm actually really looking forward to Otherkin. But I don't think that necessarily the market is oversaturated with positive decks. I think that there's room for all decks, but anywho, that is kind of my take on shadow work. Whether or not the El Goliath is truly a deck for shadow work, I think it could have been, there could have been, like I said, there could have been a different approach as far as making it a deck for shadow. I would have loved to have seen more mentions of guided shadow work in here, maybe specifically shadow meanings or like a shadow journaling prompt, or you know, how to maybe integrate the minors, like maybe a shadow works. He does have a shadow spread, I think. But maybe a more of a, let me try to pull up the spread page. Wow, why is it being so difficult right now? Oh my goodness, guidebook. It's defeating me. Yeah, he does have a, no, he doesn't even have, there's no shadow spread in here. I would have loved to have seen a shadow work spread. Would have been great. So these are the spreads that he does include with the book. There's a spiritual guidance reading, the Celtic Cross, a year ahead reading, the yes or no, how to use the yes or no cards with pendulum, outward influence reading, and do or not do. I would have loved to have seen a shadow work spread in here. That would have been great. You could have done a deviation of like self and mirror self kind of a thing. I don't know. I just think that if you're going to market a deck as a shadow work deck, it should have focused a little more on shadow work. But I will say that the deck is nice and balanced as far as its meanings are concerned. The guidebook is balanced as far as light and, you know, like the positive and negative meanings of a card. So you're definitely getting a balanced deck. And I believe he addresses this later in his frequently asked questions section, about like, why did you create a deck for shadow work? And he said it's to integrate dark and light. So I think it would have been better billed as a balanced deck, because that was one of the reasons I bought the deck to begin with, was because it was billed as a shadow working deck. And I was like, oh, great, awesome. Some guided shadow work. Who doesn't? I love shadow work. I really do. So, I don't know. That is just another part of my review. And then I think tomorrow we'll start going into the meat of the cards. So anywho, you guys, I will talk to you later. Have a wonderful afternoon. Bye.